Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. We're up on a couple services today. This is a really grim week for Israel, Palestine, and the world. I just want to say that before I get into the preliminaries. Also, I'm already screwing something up here. I'm not entirely certain where. This is not good. What have I done here? That's muting. Anyway, please let me know if I'm coming through okay. I've got some irritating double sound things going, which is not great for such a significant thing. Anyway, it is a very dark day. I don't know why I'm hearing myself in two separate places. That's not great. I guess I'll just have to grin and bear it until I figure it out. Perhaps it's here. That's where it might be. No, it just keeps going. I love it when I don't control my own environment. Thank you for coming on this dark day. Some preliminaries. There is a comment feed. I don't have the mental bandwidth to cover what's going on in the feed, and for that I have Loga Cool Extreme. He should be acting as the moderator. We have a very wide range of commentary that is allowed here. You're allowed to say many different things. However, we ask that you be respectful to other people in the chat, and this is especially important today, that you not engage in any kind of genocidal language. If you are acting out in a way that Loga, our moderator, believes is inappropriate, you will be warned once, and then you will be banned forever from the channel. So please listen to what Loga says. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. On to the incredibly grim events in Israel. One last preliminary note: I had a somewhat personally trying weekend and have not been as dived in on the minutiae and details of the horrific Hamas attack on Israel as I would like to be. What I can speak to is the historical significance of what's happened here and the truly fraught and dangerous international implications of what we're seeing right here. Over and over again, as I mentioned in a short this morning, commentary is coming back to the Yom Kippur War. I believe the Palestinians and the Arabs might have a different name for that, but it was a war in 1973 that was the last moment at which Israel was under any serious threat to its existence. The ramifications of that Yom Kippur War, U.S. support for the Israeli victory that was won, led to the initial Arab oil embargo that sort of ended the post-war era of easy economic development for the entire world. So it's just as a preliminary, I think it's worth saying that the possibilities of serious disruption to the world in general are worth paying attention to, in addition to the incredible horror of what we've seen and what we are about to see. The first thing to acknowledge is that this is a tremendous trauma for Israel. Yes, obviously the Palestinians are consistently being traumatized. But this is a real game changer for Israel, for Israeli politics, for Israeli history, for the media war. I talk a lot about on this channel when I deign to talk about Israel-Palestine, a topic I really do not like. I talk about how important the media war is. The fact that the real constraints on Israel are not Hezbollah or Hamas or Iran. The constraints are the Israeli public, and perhaps more importantly, the U.S. and European publics that will allow a high degree of crimes against humanity, but will not go beyond a certain level. That has been changed in a very serious way. And I think it's important to talk about the trauma that Israel has experienced here. Perhaps the neglect of Palestinian trauma, I'm sure, in some people's minds, because this is truly, truly significant, truly horrific. People have been bandying about Israel's 9/11. I think, frankly, that's ridiculous. This is so much worse than 9/11 from the Israeli perspective. 9/11, horrible thing that happened to the United States, was a couple folks figured out some loopholes and sent some bombs to some very politically salient and emotionally important parts of U.S. geography, and we overreacted in the worst way possible, and killed 1 million people, and it was a disaster. But the United States was never under any serious threat because of the 9/11 attacks. Israel is in nowhere near as serious a situation as they were during the Yom Kippur, well, the opening hours or days of the Yom Kippur War back in 1973. But the psychological damage, the psychological shock here is probably larger than the Yom Kippur War back in 1973. This is a bit... this is a bit rude to Israelis, I think, but the fact is that while certainly a much weaker and much more endangered country back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, it was a country with a stronger moral fiber. It was people who had survived incredible crimes and committed incredible crimes to found a country. These were incredibly tough people who made it through 1948, 1967, 1973. The Israelis of today are basically Americans. They are much like the United States after 9/11, very eager to blame all of the crimes committed against them on everything, on anybody else, and also all the crimes that they are committing on anybody else. The men who founded, men and women, let's not forget Golda Meir and others, who founded Israel, were people who knew what they had done, and as late as the 1990s were still in power in Israel and were trying to correct what had been done. The people in Israel today are not interested in that, and they are folks who've become very used to a cushy existence where they are often talking about how under threat they are and how terrible things are, and that became real. Those Israeli fantasies of threat and danger became horrifically real on Saturday. And these are not the strong, dangerous people who founded Israel. These are a bunch of cushy folks like myself, like Americans, who are going to react just as badly as the United States did to 9/11. And that's going to have some really, really nasty implications. Again, in no way would I ever be at all interested in expressing anything other than great horror and condemnation of what Hamas has done here. Let's do a little comparison here. In 1973, this was a period when Israel was in great danger. There were only 2,800 people killed over the course of that entire war. Sorry, there were only 2,800 Israelis killed over the course of that entire war. It was not a year long. This war is just barely getting started, and on its first day, somewhere between 700 and 1,000 Israelis were slaughtered. These were not soldiers. These were civilians, and these weren't even the kinds of settlers that we've rightly, not that would be okay either. Nobody should be killed. No Israeli or Palestinian should be killed. But like this, these weren't even the nasty West Bank settlers. The guys from Brooklyn pushing themselves into family homes and taking over. These weren't these people. These were honestly, there were a lot of young secular Israelis at that music festival who probably wish they were treating the Palestinians better. A truly horrific event, not just that music festival, people in their homes, families, crushed. It's of course worth pointing out that as Israel is doing now in the days since Saturday, and will continue to do at a much higher level, Israel wiping out families is something that happens all the time, and is going to continue happening, and is going to happen at a much larger scale. But that should not, the Israeli government crimes should never excuse Hamas crimes. Of course, the reverse of that is that the crimes of Hamas should not excuse the crimes that the Israeli government is committing and are about to commit. There's been a lot of memes I've seen. Generally, I'm not hugely respectful of memeing politics or what have you, but probably the Israel-Palestine conflict is more than anything else the conflict that spills over into my normie Instagram feeds. And it has been nice to see so many people. I've been blocked off of TikTok. Apparently, you can't discuss Israel-Palestine on TikTok. That's interesting to know. I'll just appeal that real quickly. But on these normie memes, and I think they've actually made a really good point. The vast majority of Israelis and Palestinians do not want this. You have really horrifically bad actors like Hamas and the Netanyahu government, and the even worse people that currently surround Netanyahu in the current Israeli government that wanted this, or if they didn't want it specifically, they put everything in place to bring it about. That is horrific, but we should keep first and foremost that these poor, slaughtered Israelis, these Israeli children and families, these poor, slaughtered Palestinians, children, families, old people, did not want this, did not ask for this. And that's something that we have to remember today and going forward. The main thing that, as again, 9/11 comparisons, 1973, Yom Kippur War, big threat. I mean, that's 2,800 Israelis dead. We're going to see vastly more than that if the very likely attempt to reconquer Gaza starts, which is expected as soon as today. It's not 100% guaranteed, as we'll talk about, but it seems very likely. The casualties for Israel from this war will dwarf the Yom Kippur War. I looked at the 6 Days War, and it was, I think, under 1,000 Israeli soldiers died in the 6-day war, the tremendous conquest that got Israel the occupied territories, West Bank, Gaza, and actually the Sinai as well. This war is going to dwarf those in terms of cost for Israel, and that is worth marking. Also, just keep in mind that, it was only 1,000 Israelis that died on Saturday, or thereabouts under that, whereas, it was 2,000 or 3,000 Americans that died on 9/11. The U.S. population is 34 times the size of Israel's. This is the equivalent of 30,000 people dying on 9/11, if you can imagine what that would have been like. So I do not want to in any way undermine the crime that Hamas has committed here. However, on this channel, as we've been talking about recently with Nagorno-Karabakh, and as is pretty obvious with all of my coverage about U.S. empire and whatnot, is that I'm always interested in power. I'm interested in who is the more powerful actor, and the more powerful actor is always more responsible. I mean, not always more responsible, but if you keep in mind who has the power here, then it's much more clarifying, and I think it's a wiser way to see every conflict. It's why I would never do anything other than condemn Putin's invasion of Ukraine. I understand the roots of that, I think, with a little more complexity and understanding of the U.S. role in creating that war, when I acknowledge that, unlike the Pentagon propaganda that Putin may love, Russia is in no way any kind of rival to the United States. China is in no serious way yet a serious rival to the United States. And no serious analyst can look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and imagine that anybody other than Israel has the power here. It's quite, it's not even a real question. What makes this so strange is that for once, if you look at this graph that showed up in the New York Times, I got it off of, I believe, Max Fisher's Twitter feed. If you look at the past 15 years of Israel-Palestine conflict, you can see just how incredibly imbalanced this is. I know a lot of folks find it outrageous that anyone would look at or consider this issue. But actually, in the context of 2023 and the ongoing conflict, it shows just how different and how traumatic this is for Israel. What Israel is used to is a conflict, you can't see me putting that in air quotes, where a handful of Israelis get caught out by the few missiles that make it through the shield or what have you, and then by a factor of 10 times as many Palestinians die. Horrifically, I don't expect this conflict to be any different. I expect that this likely, very, very likely, Israeli incursion into Gaza to take out Hamas. If you look at things in the briefest, even I would agree as a strong critic of Israel and U.S. action that the attacks on Saturday simply have to be answered. But the horror of what's going to ensue gives me great pause. I think many more Israelis are going to die, and we're going to see that math of 10x Palestinians dying very likely to be repeated. So this graph is not going to look as strange in terms of the relation between Israeli deaths and Palestinian deaths as it does right now. It's just going to dwarf every conflict we've seen there for 15 years. I think the chances of 10,000 plus Palestinians being killed are very likely. Keep in mind that we've gotten used to watching the Ukraine war, where we're talking about where we're talking about potentially death counts in getting into the hundreds of thousands. But again, Russia and Ukraine, Russia is a country of, gosh, it's not at my fingertips, but 120 to 160 million people. Ukraine is a country of 40 million people. Gaza is an arena, and this is, of course, assuming the conflict is limited to Gaza, which already it really isn't. Gaza is a population of 2 to 2.5 million. So if we're talking about 10,000 casualties, we're talking about 10,000 deaths. We're talking about a truly horrific situation that is likely to develop. This is all incredibly sad and horrible. I'm trying to think if there was something else I wanted to say about this other than profound sadness, profound. I don't talk about Israel-Palestine on this channel very much. For years, I just refused to touch it because I was so afraid of how both my American and Arab audiences would deal with it. But I got over that some years ago. And specifically 2 years ago, in 2021, I did a 2-hour live chat where I carefully laid out for the last time just how incredibly grim I find the future of Israel-Palestine. It's not really a joke. It may sound funny. Like, I prefer on this channel to focus on hopeful countries like Sudan, Somalia, and Afghanistan, rather than the incredibly dark future of Israel-Palestine. But if you want to get a fuller read on what I feel about Israel-Palestine specifically, you can check out the link to that 2-hour presentation from a couple years back in this description. It's pretty dark. It is worth pointing out how extremely the Israeli government has failed here. It is an extraordinary intelligence failure. For those who, what Hamas did here is completely unexpected and unprecedented. Hamas is previously been known for sort of sending non-too effective missiles into Israel, doing sort of marches on the border that are taken out by snipers. This was carefully planned, carefully sourced, and on Saturday, Hamas was able to overrun the Israeli border in the south. Attack, I think, upwards of 20 separate locations, military and civilian, within Israel. This is a tremendous failure. Nothing like this has happened to Israel since 1973. A tremendous, tremendous failure, and carried out. It's important. 1973 was carried out. The attack on Israel in 1973 that got about as far. No, it got a little bit further. Was carried out by Syria and Egypt, two major militaries with, even back then, populations in the tens of millions. Major military sources heavily funded by the Soviet Union, a Soviet power, heavily superpower, heavily funded and armed. Hamas is supported by Iran to a degree, is supported by many other Arab actors to a degree. Iran is not an Arab actor, to a degree, but it's through tunnels. This is a tremendously starved and isolated open-air prison. And yes, there are means through which Iran has been able to smuggle some weapons to them. But this is nothing like the forces that Israel faced in 1973, which were real countries, real militaries that came at them with massive tanks. No, but Hamas was able, because of incredible intelligence failure, because of incredible neglect on the part of the Netanyahu government, was able to overrun a number of border posts, kill a number of Israeli soldiers, take a number of Israeli soldiers hostages, and then let loose, presumably not just Hamas fighters, but also significant chunks of, just sort of melee, angry young men from Gaza. Let them loose on Israel for a period of 12 to 24 hours. It does seem like this incursion has been completely wiped out. I think by Monday afternoon, I think by Saturday, by Sunday morning, I assume most of this was actually squashed, and it has been finally wiped out as of Monday evening, the Hamas incursion. But it is an extraordinary humiliation for Israel that this was, and the Netanyahu government in particular, that this was something that could happen, that they just simply did not notice this. I've seen there's some reports that the Egyptians actually warned Israel that this was, the Netanyahu government, that this was coming. I've seen a lot of doubt being cast on those reports, though. This is a very fluid situation. Who knows? Obviously, though, the Egyptian government is formally allied with Israel, allied, perhaps alliance overstates it. And they certainly collaborate to oppress Gaza, Egypt and Israel. There are many folks in the Egyptian government who are more sympathetic to the Gazans and hate Netanyahu, as really, it seems like most of the world hates Netanyahu. So it's entirely possible that that's not true. But what is true is that significant components in the Israeli security state were warning Netanyahu that the defenses to the south were being neglected in favor of the Netanyahu's government's choice to escalate things in the West Bank. There is a distinction for those who may not know. Let's look at the map here. This is a smaller zoomed-in view of Israel here. We have the West Bank, which is frankly where a lot of the drama happens here. You have a lot of Palestinians. You have a ton of settlers, Israeli settlers, moving their way into the West Bank, that sort of very large chunk of territory in the middle there. The Hamas does not have power. I mean, they have some infiltration, some influence in the West Bank. It is run, the West Bank is run by the spectacularly corrupt Palestinian Authority that works closely with the Israeli government, sometimes, often. And much of what we hear about settlers forcing out Palestinians, the ethnic cleansing, the battles between Israeli settlers and Palestinians, incredibly one-sided battles where the Israeli military will always come in and help the settlers, but the Palestinians have no recourse. That happens in the West Bank. What we're focused on here is the Gaza Strip. That is where Hamas has power. Gaza Strip looks tiny compared to the West Bank. It is less populated than the West Bank, but it is in fact one of the most densely populated places on earth. All of Israel is what, 10, 15 million people, I think, if you include the subject Palestinian populations in the West Bank and Gaza, about 15 million people, I believe. The Gaza Strip, that tiny little strip of territory there, has 2.5 million people. It is incredibly dense. And it was in the borders of the Gaza Strip where this incursion happened. What the Netanyahu government has been doing, especially in the vastly new, much more right-wing version that has recently taken power after Netanyahu was out for, I think, was just a period of 8 or 9 months, has mostly been focused on the West Bank and expanding settlements, making things worse there for Palestinians, and prompting the kinds of incidents and problems that make it easy to get more Israelis to hate Palestinians and satisfy the sort of the more eliminationist elements of Israel. Netanyahu thought he had Gaza handled. He liked that they were extreme and could always be used and seen as scary, but also, I'm not too familiar with the minutiae on this, but from a number of not just crazy leftist sources, my understanding is that he had a kind of, felt like he had a kind of arrangement with Hamas. Qatar was allowed to provide them with certain funding, this, that, and the other thing, in return for sort of a balance of power there. Netanyahu felt like he had a free hand to go brutalize the West Bank because Gaza was sort of like, oh, we know what's going on there. And apparently the basic defenses of the around the Gaza Strip were neglected to an obscene amount, obscene degree, which is why we have this horrific, which is why this attack was able to be as horrifically successful as it was. So that's an incredible failure. Another thing, which actually is something that I kind of enjoy here, is the obscene failure of the Abraham Accords. I've been talking for years now about what a joke these are. The Abraham Accords were cooked up by Donald Trump or someone in Donald Trump's administration. The idea being that, you know what, forget the Palestinians. We're just going to figure out how to get Arab countries to sign deals with Israel. The Arab countries that were found to sign deals with Israel were the least responsive dictatorships least responsive to their people dictatorships in the region. The UAE, I think it was the UAE, Morocco, Sudan, and Bahrain. I can't remember what the fourth one is. The UAE is, of course, an absolute monarchy. Morocco is less absolute monarchy, but still pretty absolute, and was able to sell this peace deal with Israel that their public hates by getting U.S. acknowledgement of their annexing of Western Sahara, which is a nationalist priority for Morocco. Sudan, of course, this isn't the only reason that Sudan's fledgling democratic government died, but it certainly contributed to the death of Sudan's fledgling civilian government, and it is now fallen into horrific civil war. The Abraham Accords were always a joke. They were always Washington, D.C. politics, not Middle East politics. It's the kind of thing you can believe actually helps make things better in the Middle East if your only sense of what's good for the Middle East is what's good for Israel. There simply was no benefit for peace in the region provided. It was just getting different funders of different parts of the Washington, D.C. think tank world to get happier about being pals. The Gulf monarchies are incredibly influential in Washington, D.C. Israel is also very influential in Washington, D.C. The Abraham Accords were always a joke. And they were premised on the idea that we can just ignore the Palestinians. Who cares? We'll just move on. It certainly oversells it to say that Hamas carried out this attack now exclusively because of these deals. The Biden administration decided to also pursue these dumb ideas, and as I've talked about on the channel a fair amount, was contemplating, in order to get Saudi Arabia to sign an accord with Israel, the United States was seriously contemplating a NATO-type relationship, like a treaty obligation to defend the Saudi royal family. It's one of the most disgusting things I can imagine. True betrayal of any basic principle of anti-monarchy that the United States might have from its founding, and also they're the guys who did 9/11. But for Washington, D.C. internal politics, it was seen as a good thing for the U.S. to sign some kind of incredibly generous deal with Saudi Arabia, so Saudi Arabia would sign a deal with Israel. And everybody just sort of blithely moved along with this, assuming that the Palestinians weren't anything you had to think about. Hamas has changed that. The Abraham Accords and Netanyahu's entire policy of we can be as brutal as we want, we can just marginalize the Palestinians further and further with no consequences, that seems to be largely over, and that is worth talking about. Finally, I think we're going to get to the international ramifications, which are quite dark, potentially quite dark. Israel, I mean, even for me, for a day or two, though that has dissipated as I've gotten more into this, but for any political commentator in the United States, Israel's hands have been untied. They can do whatever they want to Gaza without any pushback at all from the Biden administration. Not forever. If we're truly seeing tens of thousands of Palestinians being murdered in an ongoing war, then maybe a month or two from now, they would be slowed or stopped, or the Biden administration would urge restraint or what have you. That's gone. The traditional constraint on Israeli action against Palestinians has been entirely removed. That would be like U.S. concerns and U.S. shame. The restraint on Israel now, however, is somewhat different, which is what would actually the ramifications be of completely retaking Gaza. This is an artifact of the really difficult situation that Israel and the United States have created for Israel over the past 20 years or so. Really, 60 years. If we go back and look at this map here, the reason that Netanyahu has been so focused on the West Bank is that populations are dispersed. It's a big set of territory that's very historically important to the Israeli people and Jewish people more broadly. I think Bethlehem, I think, is still a Palestinian town, though who knows for how much longer. Tremendously significant area that is heavily populated in parts, but can be sort of worked on in ways. The Gaza Strip is incredibly dense, incredibly filled with humanity, of nowhere near as much historical significance to Israel or national significance to Israel. So much so that a decade or so back, Ariel Sharon, who's sort of largely known as one of the most brutal anti-Palestinian fighters in Israel's history, probably more deserving than most of the title of war criminal, pulled all Israeli settlers out of the Gaza Strip because it was judged to simply not be worth it. Under the Bush administration, Hamas won an election in Gaza and has been in control ever since. But even with that, up until Saturday, it looked like that was something that Israel could manage, that was easier to manage than actually having to go in and take control of this territory again. Israel has more or less complete control of the West Bank. There's different gradations of, types of territories. You can find a map of the areas. Some areas of the West Bank are completely controlled by the Israeli military. Some, and it looks like Swiss cheese. Some areas are controlled in a weird cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli military. And then really, I think it's mostly just large population centers are directly controlled by the Palestinian Authority. It's not at all viable as an entity. The Gaza Strip is viable as an entity, And the idea of having to go in and conquer this territory of 2.5 million people, not just the Palestinian casualties are going to be so high that it even gives elements of the Israeli security establishment pause, I believe. And the Israeli casualties that would be necessary to take that territory. And then what the hell do we do after, once we've taken that territory? We're supposed to somehow set up a new Israeli-run government. The Palestinian Authority, the famous joke, is not going to have the ability to take control. It's an incredibly dark question, and I think that's what the Israeli government is wrestling with at this point. They're not being held back in their offensive, which is likely to start and could very well be starting as we're speaking. They're not being held back in their offensive by concerns about what the United States or Europe might think, which is the traditional concern, which is gone because of Hamas's crimes. They're held up by, like, what would this actually mean? Beyond just the question of what would it mean for Gaza, the implications get much larger if you look at the wider region. The potential concern, the biggest potential concern for Israel right now, is what happens if Hezbollah gets involved. Hamas controls the Gaza Strip, that little chunk of space there. Hezbollah, weirdly, since the 2006 war, where Israel attempted to take out Hezbollah and failed, I think largely because of U.S. rules of engagement constraints. The northern border of Israel with Lebanon has been fairly stable because Hezbollah has established a degree of deterrence with Israel. Hezbollah is a much, much more serious, much more significant international military actor, and that's again to the north of Israel on this map here. They have thus far, there have absolutely been shots fired between the Israeli Defense Forces and Hezbollah at the north of Israel over the past 72 hours, but large-scale war has not started. It has not occurred. This is a real possibility. This is something that the Israeli government really, really, really doesn't want, because then the war just gets bigger. Both Hamas in the south of Israel, on the Egyptian border there on the sea, and Hezbollah in the bottom of Lebanon, which controls the bottom of Lebanon, are deeply, deeply related to Iran, of course. So if a wider conflict starts between Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah, the chances of Iran getting involved become much higher. In fact, they can already be seen to be involved. The United States has already sent a carrier group into the Mediterranean to get closer to hopefully deter Iran and Hezbollah from jumping in on this. It's worth pointing out that Iran and Hezbollah don't want this war either. I think there's been a source of some speculation. This could be entirely inaccurate. I don't think anybody in Hamas is at all sad about how well their offensive went. I think they are perfectly fine with all of the slaughter of innocents, all of the destruction that was wrought. They would have been happier. The only way they could have been happier is if they'd killed 2,000 Israelis and gone further and what have you. I do think that Hezbollah, Iran, other actors have been shocked and frankly a little unnerved by just how successful Hamas was. It's shocking how badly the Netanyahu government mismanaged their border with Gaza, just sort of assumed things were fine. I think this has been a lot bigger and a lot worse than most expected. The Wall Street Journal, I think it was yesterday, perhaps the day before, ran an article that said that Iran and the Revolutionary Guard Corps, I can never remember what IGRC stands for, but the Iranian sort of military wing that's been classified as a terror group, were deeply involved in the planning of this and gave it the go-ahead and the green light. It's fascinating how quickly that Wall Street Journal report has been savaged by every Middle East journalist, by the Iranian government and Hamas, perhaps unsurprisingly, but also by the U.S. and Israeli governments. The U.S. and Israeli governments have said that there's no reason to believe that Iran was deeply involved in the planning of this operation or responsible for this operation. It is, there's no question, everybody knows that, and Iran not confesses, but it proudly talks about how they support Hezbollah and Hamas, which they see as resistance groups. But Iran firmly maintains, I think more truthfully in Hamas's case, less truthfully in Hezbollah's case, that they are independent actors. And it seems like at this juncture, explicitly because Israel and the United States do not want a wider war at this juncture, the U.S. and Israeli governments are beating up on that Wall Street Journal article talking about Iran's direct responsibility for these Hamas attacks as well. So that's kind of a fascinating dynamic. And you can see why, because if they do, if the Iranians, and I saw just a few minutes before starting this presentation, the Iranian supreme leader came out. This is not a guy who really does generally anything other than sound tough. He came out and said we had nothing to do with the Hamas attack. He certainly didn't condemn it. He would never do that. But he said that the Iranian government had nothing to do with it. And I think that that's significant and that's very hopeful. I think I'd mentioned I was not having the best weekend this weekend. But yeah, I saw that Wall Street Journal story yesterday and I was just like, oh God, here we go. Because if that Wall Street Journal story were confirmed, if the Iranian government was like, yes, we did that Hamas thing, we helped carry out the biggest attack on Israel since 1973, that's war with Israel and Iran. And because of the savagery of the attack, the very small voices in Washington, D.C. that might restrain wholehearted support of Israel's war with Iran would be silenced as well. So if that would be the U.S.'s next $1 trillion war in the Middle East. That's the big potential international implication here. If that Wall Street Journal article were true, if Iran took responsibility for this, if Israel decided to blame Iran for this, that would mean a wider war. Israel has the capacity to brutalize Gaza entirely, probably has the capacity to also fight a limited war against Hezbollah, but to do both at once, to basically invade Lebanon and invade Gaza at the same time, they would need U.S. support. And if the Iranian government were conclusively proven to have created this Hamas war, I believe they would have gotten it. So yeah, when I saw this Wall Street Journal report, I was like, this is it. This is what I've been warning about for a decade. This is the next $1 trillion U.S. war. And that would have been absolutely horrific and an incredibly stupid thing that remains incredibly possible. Hezbollah has thus far restrained itself, largely because the broader Lebanese populace is getting very sick of Hezbollah dragging them into wars with Israel. But actually, if the Gaza war gets as bad as it could be, and this is a consideration for the Israeli government right now as well, if the Israeli reconquest of Gaza takes place, then Hezbollah may feel honor-bound to get involved. So this possibility of a broader regional war is very real, more real than it's ever been. And it's largely coming about from the U.S. perspective because we've given this incredibly crappy Netanyahu government such a blank check for so long. Such a tremendous mistake. But a very real possibility. I think it's perhaps worth playing out a couple things. I think that a lot of folks have been, one of the most extraordinary conversations I've had in the recent days with a sort of buddy of mine in Washington, D.C., who's usually pretty good at giving interesting sort of scuttlebutt. But it was I talked to him and he was like, the Russians did this. This was the Russians. This was definitely the Russians. And that's a really weird but not particularly shocking Washington, D.C. perspective. it can look that way to the United States, as if all of our adversaries are coordinating against us, because the United States has made a choice to be tremendously aggressively involved in Ukraine, in Taiwan, and in the Middle East. We're never going to care as much about the Middle East as Iran does. We're never going to care as much about Ukraine as Russia does. We're never going to care as much about Taiwan as China does. And it's not saying that these successive targets of the U.S. are somehow Machiavellian geniuses, moving the parts around because they're taking advantage of the incredible lack of U.S. focus. It's just simply there's no Russian masterminding here that you need to make the Palestinians angry at the Israelis. I find that really, that sort of whole genre of looking at things really hard to credit. I think it's worth talking about what would happen if there was a wider war. People are assuming that it's this would be terrible for the United States. We're in a multilateral world now, which is utter nonsense. We're not in a multilateral world. We're in a world where the last few countries that have any sovereignty left at all are all besieged by the United States on their borders. China with Taiwan, Russia with Ukraine, and Iran with, Azerbaijan, with Iraq, with Saudi Arabia. It's absurd. We're living in a world of consolidating U.S. empire, not a more multilateral world. I mean, just think about that again for a second. It's a multilateral world because the United States is battling really hard over Russian-speaking territories, Chinese-speaking territories, and Arabic-speaking territories. Yeah, anyway, that's just another random pet peeve. And frankly, if there were a broader war with Iran, the upshot would be, I think Jack Hawkins was talking about this in a comment earlier today, but it's certainly not the first time I've thought about it. The upshot would be the utter destruction of Gulf oil production. Saudi Arabia's oil production would be destroyed. Iran's oil production would be destroyed, and the United States would be the primary beneficiary of a brand new. Imagine the 1973 oil crisis. That's one of the comparisons I've gone to in result of the Yom Kippur War, except the United States is OPEC. That's the most likely upshot of a broader war between Iran and the United States. Texas and, talk about windfall profits. You'd see a barrel of oil go from the doldrums that they've been in since 2014 to the absolute moon, $200 a barrel, $300 a barrel, and the United States would reap the majority of the benefit. So because Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq and Kuwait would all be in ruins. Folks who are hoping that this is some kind of fall of American empire type dynamic, no, this, as with almost everything else I cover on this channel, is consolidation of U.S. empire. The scarier, honestly, in many ways scarier possibility here is not Iran, but what could happen to Egypt as a result of a broader crushing of Gaza by Israel. This is a lot scarier. Iran, at the end of the day, is an incredibly rational and restrained actor dealing with U.S. and Israeli nutcases on the international scene. I think if we're going to avoid, Saudi Arabia has got to be, and this is in part why Saudi Arabia has been trying for years now to come to some kind of understanding with Iran, is that Iran is obviously the sane and stable actor in the Middle East. And I think we can maybe rely on Iran to restrain Hezbollah and not start this wider war, because obviously the Iranians wouldn't benefit from that either. So that's a hopeful. By the end of the week, folks, we could see Saudi Arabia, Iran, most of the Gulf oil industry as a smoking ruin, but I don't think that's likely. I'm saying that's a strong possibility. Egypt is even scarier, frankly, though it would be in a sort of quieter, more insidious way that probably wouldn't make it to the into the news in the United States much. Egypt is a truly foul dictatorship run by a U.S. and Israeli client for the past decade. Sisi is his name. He's entirely complicit in maintaining Gaza as an open-air prison. It would not be possible without him. I think that some folks on the Discord channel, patrons-only Discord channel, which you should sign up for. You should sign up, you should be a patron. Some folks on the Discord channel were talking about how great it would be if it unseated Sisi, and I can't but agree how great it would be if Sisi were to fall. But what if the Gaza war gets truly horrific, and you've got all of a sudden hundreds of thousands of Palestinians showing up in Cairo? What if it gets truly horrific and Sisi falls violently, and what comes next is what? I really don't. I think it's unfair and a bad idea to paint every national version of the Muslim Brotherhood with the same brush. But the truth is that Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood affiliated organization. The main democratic opposition in Egypt is Muslim Brotherhood. If a Muslim Brotherhood government were to come to power in Egypt in the context of Gaza being slaughtered, then you're going to have a much more Hamas-adjacent government in Egypt. But that's not really the scary question. The scary question is, are you going to have government in Egypt at all? Egypt is a country of 110 million people. The U.S. destruction of Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and Libya, all of that together, that's still only, 60, 75 million people, and dispersed over a vast geography. Egypt, 100 million people, 110 million people, if that government fell, and fell in a particularly disordered way, it would not be what it was in 2012 when we had a democratic process that replaced the last dictatorship before Sisi came in and slaughtered thousands in 2013. True disorder. The European Union has lost its mind over the past decade, dealing with 1 million refugees. Okay, how about 10 million refugees? Well, they wouldn't let in 10 million refugees. They'd just start gunning people down at their borders. North Africa was entirely destabilized by the U.S. destruction of Libya in 2011, the constant coups, the never-ending jihadism, what have you. That's all downstream from that fun NATO thing we did back in 2011. Libya is a country of 6 or 7 million. Egypt is a country of 100 million. The Egyptian public is already very sick of Sisi, and it's really hard to imagine how his government would survive the deaths of tens of thousands of Gazans. Those are some pretty big, pretty bad international implications. I think that I'm delighted to see that there are 280 people here. I've completed the part of my presentation where I'm blathering. Now it's time for questions and answers. Any questions you might have, jump in the chat. I'll try to stick to questions about what we've been talking to today, but I'll really talk about anything. I always answer the questions from people who do a super chat. So if you give me money, I'm definitely going to answer your question. It's a bit mercenary, I apologize, but I do need to somehow afford to keep doing this. If you found this presentation interesting and you're new here, I'd highly recommend checking out my produced videos on the YouTube channel. I'm very proud of those. I think they provide a worthwhile perspective on the world that is not often provided. If you really like what I'm doing, you could sign up to support me on Patreon, and I would love that. So what do we have questions? How would the Muslim world respond to the death of thousands of Palestinians? Well, thousands of Palestinians, we already know how the Muslim world will respond to the death of thousands of Palestinians, because that's something that happens all the time. Not all the time, but every couple of years that happens. Sometimes more extreme, sometimes less. I ran a video a year or two back talking about how Israel's getting worse at the media war. It's becoming harder and harder to believe that Israel's under any real threat. That is not an issue after Saturday. So Israel has a freer hand. But the depressing answer is that the Arab world cares less and less. The Muslim world cares less and less about what happens to Palestine. It's actually been very interesting. This is probably just a brief thing, but it was interesting the number of comments that were showing up from not necessarily folks from the Muslim world, from the global South more generally, that said that, oh, Hamas has really changed how I feel about the Palestinians. I don't expect that to last in a broader sense. What's kind of interesting is Turkey. Turkey has, over the past, Turkey had a huge blow up with Israel over Gaza specifically in 2010 or 11, the Mavi Marmara. A bunch of Turkish activists tried to bring goods to Gaza and were killed by Israeli special forces. This ruined relations between the countries for years. Those relations are good again. Since 2015, the Turks have really stepped up their aggression against Kurds, which was something that had been tamped down in the first decade of the century. So now there's a traditional Turkish-Israeli affinity over crushing their minorities, and that's coming back. So the Turks don't care much. The Saudis are trying to sign a deal. I do think that one positive thing about this is that the whole deal making between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia to get Saudi Arabia to sign a deal with Israel, that seems very unlikely now. That seems like that's no longer a real possibility. Why was Chuck Schumer, it's a great question, Star Porcello, and I don't have an answer. Why was Chuck Schumer so eager to go to China and make Xi Jinping condemn the attack? I have no idea. That is not a news story that I have seen. My guess, Star Pulsara, would be that Chuck Schumer is always, and all Democrats are always looking for cheap ways to seem anti-China, or to seem like they're pressuring China, being tough on China, as are all Republicans. What China could conceivably have to do, what conceivably could China have to do with the Middle East? I think that's a broader question that I am equipped to answer, Star Prasada, so I hope you don't mind me switching focus a little bit here. China's influence in the Middle East has been drastically overstated. In fact, this was part of Saudi Arabia's PR campaign to try to get this Saudi, Israel, US, Saudi deal going. The Saudis lost in Yemen years ago. They've known they've lost in Yemen years ago. They've been trying to negotiate for the Iranians with the Iranians for years. The Yemenis have established deterrence. Saudi can't bomb Yemen anymore without the Yemenis bombing back. So the Saudis, under the auspices of the UN, even the U.S. envoy a little bit, the Saudis and the Iranians have been negotiating. Whatever, was it 2 months back, 3 months back, I can't remember. They finally came to some kind of very limited agreement. And the Saudis in particular, this was recently, I can't remember what I was listening to, but yeah, it seems like the Saudis in particular roped in China because they wanted to embarrass Biden and make him more likely to sign this new NATO deal with them. So I think it's been tremendously overstated. It's part of this broader dynamic where everybody in the world is pulling for this same myth of multilateralism. So China and Russia want to seem powerful and seem like it's a multipolar world. So yeah, we're powerful like for nationalist purposes, whereas the US propaganda actually has the opposite. Like the whole point of US government and media is selling weapons and making Americans feel insecure. So actually, the US propaganda and the Chinese and the Russian propaganda are pulling in the same direction towards a myth of multipolarity that does not exist. A big facet of that myth of multipolarity is the idea that China has some big new power in the Middle East, which is simply bullshit. I can swear here, yes, it is bullshit. It's just not true. So that is probably why Chuck Schumer was talking about how important it would be to get Xi Jinping to condemn a terrorist attack in the Middle East when it would be largely meaningless. D-Man33 asks, is it crazy to think that the Sykes-Picot state system is over? Yes, it is crazy to think that the Sykes-Picot system is over. Sykes-Picot, I believe, refers to specifically a French and British agreement to divvy up the Middle East after World War One, I believe, or actually before the end of World War One, like a secret treaty, and that's pretty nasty, because the Americans came in supposedly to free the world from empire. Okay, that's not true. But the French and the British were making all kinds of nasty deals to divvy up the world that they were going to take from the Ottomans and the Germans. But also there's this broader idea that, Africa and the Middle East can never be stable because these borders aren't real because they were created in imperial back rooms by a bunch of Europeans. That's true to a degree, for sure. But that's also true from 100 years ago. All of these countries have entered the era of literacy and television and nationalism with a centralized government. For some countries, specifically in northern sub-Saharan Africa, the basic rudiments of state and nation are still really, really, really fragile because of a lot of just the 1973 oil crisis. Basically, they became independent and then had to start dealing with the crushing of world economic development because of the 1973 oil crisis. And then finally, they looked like they were having a good first decade of the century, and then NATO destroyed Libya, spewing jihadis and ripping out the economic heart of North Africa. But anyway, so there are certainly many places where these borders are fraught, but not as many as you'd think, really. And the fact is that even as artificial as these countries initially were, if you've got a century of literacy and state building and whatnot behind you, it's actually far worse to rip up those lines. I think the Islamic State, when it was first starting in 2014, talked a lot about Sykes-Picot. Because, of course, Sykes-Picot was specifically referring, I believe, to what the French and British did to divvy up the Middle East. Well, despite the fact that Syria is nowhere near knit together again, is nowhere near back to any kind of order, there's still a Syria, there's still an Iraq, and there will continue to be. So I don't think there's any real danger to the sort of system of international states more broadly that we put together. Who is the Chuck guy? I don't know who the Chuck guy is. Question, do we have any more super chats? Question from, was that Rune Power? Robert, will Israel bomb Gaza until they displace the Palestinians into Egypt, given that they're being given a green light by the U.S.? The U.S. has not given Israel a green light for genocide, for ethnic cleansing and genocide. There are certainly elements within the Israeli media sphere that are calling for that. There are elements I've had people I know who've been talking about, it's time to just sort of kick all the Palestinians out, which is that. I'm like, that's ethnic cleansing. That's Nazi stuff. It's really kind of sick how people are willing to talk about it. The U.S. government, however, is nominally super invested in the idea of human rights, and I believe there's still, at this point, enough concern about that kind of thing that we're not yet to the point where large-scale ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip is possible. If only because the Netanyahu government knows that if they did that, Egypt would be destabilized and they'd potentially have to be dealing with not 2.5 million angry people at their border, but 112.5 angry people at their border. I don't think that's really on the cards. Horrifically, unfortunately, I get into this in the chat. I have linked in the description. I do think that the chances of the Israeli-Palestinian question being settled with large-scale ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians is very possible. Not next year, not in 5 years, but by the end of the century. Which is really horrific, and is a reason I really don't like talking about Israel-Palestine very much, because the U.S. is real complicit in that. Okay, I've got two super chats. My gosh. Wait, was there another one? Oh, yep, two. Okay, gotta. Oh wait, oh no, there's three. I gotta catch up. The global South isn't a united thing. Latin America and most of Christian Africa doesn't care about Palestine or Arabs in general. I think that can be oversold. I think you're right in that they don't have the affinity that I mean, but what is that affinity from Muslim countries or Arab countries really worth? But actually, global South, I think India, when it's not something that India is interested in doing anymore because, Modi and Netanyahu, enjoy their fellow hyper-nationalism or what have you. Which of course goes to your point, Banana Palm, that the global South is not a united thing. I do think that people really, really underestimate the level of resentment of Israel that you have because of the fact, and this is, I know any Israeli would see this as unfair. Israelis are very keen to point out that there's tons and tons of, was it Mizrahi, indigenous Middle Eastern Jews. Yet all the people who've all ever run the country, I think there's more. I think if you look at presidents and prime ministers, there have been more from Wisconsin than there have been from the Middle East. They're mostly from Belarus. It is incredibly controversial to say, and I'm aware of the arguments against it. I don't find them particularly credible, but I think it is to some degree fair to see Israel as a white European settler project and the last one that's left. I think it's an open question as the era of decolonization falls further and further into the past. Is that becoming less of a dynamic? I think certainly, I haven't checked this, but I would assume that in 1967 and 1973 that India was speaking up for the Arabs. I would assume. Could be wrong about that. That's not the case anymore. So I think I, as a 20th century man, sort of believe that there's a lot of anti-colonial solidarity for the Palestinians. Hamas certainly took a dump on a lot of that. But I do believe that in the global South more generally, Latin America, Africa, there is an affinity and sympathy, at least among intellectual classes, for the Palestinians that is not based on anti-Semitism, is based on, we don't like that there's a bunch of white people pushing around a bunch of brown people in historic brown people territory. But you're absolutely right, Banana Palm, the global South is not a united thing. The Latin America and most of Africa doesn't care about Palestine or Arabs in general. I don't think that's necessarily true, but certainly an argument you can make. Jaser, after this war ends, what do you think? What is Jaser? After this war ends, what do you think the ultimate solution to this conflict is? I think I said that earlier, Jack. I unfortunately think that the status quo will continue for quite some time, and then there will be, in a broader U.S., I think a broader Israel-Iran war, if it ever happens, World War III type situation, a real broader war. I think Israel will use that and I deeply hope that won't happen in any of our lifetimes. But that doesn't necessarily mean I don't think it'll happen in one of our lifetimes. A broader world war or a broader regional war. Israel will, for security reasons, use that as an excuse to put a bunch of Palestinians on buses to Cairo and Amman and deal with those who don't want to go differently. So yeah, I think that the ultimate. I think that I've mentioned that in the 1990s there were still Israelis who realized they had a debt to the Palestinians and wanted to come to some kind of settlement to make up for what they had done to form their own state. I think that those Israelis are all dead of old age or assassinated by Israeli radicals, as an Israeli prime minister was in the 1990s. Is that Yitzhak Rabin, I believe? One of the founders of the country that was murdered by a spoiled little shit with a gun because they felt that one of the founders of the country wasn't a serious enough supporter of Israel because he was being too nice to the Palestinians. So I fear, and especially after Saturday, if there was a chance for a two-state solution, if there was a chance for broader reconciliation between Israel and Palestine, I think that Saturday's Hamas attack may have ended it, and certainly what Israel's about to do to Gaza may have ended it. So I think what the world is and the United States is eventually going to demand is some kind of return to the horrific status quo that created Hamas. If we're lucky, we could get a broader regional war that destroys the Gulf oil industry that I was talking about. But if we're lucky, I think what we'll get is a status quo that continues until there's a big enough war for Israel to justify a more final solution. It just feels really gross using that kind of language, but it's a pretty gross situation. Oh, there's another. Where was that super chat? Do you think this will affect the Syrian civil war? To the extent that the Syrian civil war is driven by Israeli or U.S. skullduggery, I don't think as we're certainly learning, the Mossad is nowhere near as impressive or intimidating as they once were. If they could have allowed this nightmare to happen and be as effective and monstrously effective as it was. But there's no question that, Israel bombs Syria all the time to make Assad and his Iranian allies weaker. I do expect that there will be less of that in the next couple weeks. I think that many aspects of the Syrian civil war were getting more unstable, not just in the areas that Assad controls, but in the areas that the U.S. sponsored elements, the Kurds in the north, control. So maybe it'll be a little bit of respite for Syria, but I think that the capabilities of the CIA and the Mossad in Syria are quite overstated at this point. So maybe it doesn't make too much difference, but I would expect at least that there will be a little bit less Israeli bombing of Hezbollah in Syria. And that might help Assad and the general cause of Syrian stability in a small way. Was there another super chat? Okay, no more super chats. So questions. Do you think Iran will go for mass war? Asks Mohammed Ibrahim. I think that's the biggest question. That is the biggest question. I think that the Supreme Leader coming out this morning and saying we had nothing to do with it is an indicator that they don't want mass war. But I think that what Hezbollah does, what remember the Arab Street, what the broader read on so from world media and whatnot is will have a great impact on what happens, on what Iran does. If there truly are tens of thousands of Palestinians killed by this Israeli incursion into Gaza, who knows? Yeah, I mean that's the big question, and I'm sorry I don't have a more concrete answer for you, but that's the biggest question right now. That's the question of whether, because in this environment, if Iran and Israel go to war, the U.S. will join in on Israel's side. There's no question in my mind. Why doesn't Egypt open the Rafah border crossing and let in some refugees from Gaza? I mean, haven't they? I don't know the details of this. I'm sorry, Reynold. I haven't looked into this. But also, Egypt doesn't want all those Palestinians. Despite the fact that Egypt is a much more populous place, I think it remembers very well the destabilization of both Lebanon and Jordan in different ways by large-scale Palestinian refugees. Also, Egypt has an investment in not participating in Israeli ethnic cleansing of Gaza. So, I think to open the borders, for basic humanity, that'd be a very good thing to do, but it's important to point out that if you do that, you're aiding ethnic cleansing of Gaza. which I don't think Egypt wants to do. As far as like the details of like, unfortunately, I'm not up on what has or has not happened at the border crossing. I think I saw something on Twitter very briefly that talked about Egypt being bombed. Talking about a border crossing to Egypt from Gaza being bombed. There are multiple people in Gaza who have U.S. and European and other passports who would be allowed to cross out of Gaza into Egypt. So yeah, I don't know the details about that though, unfortunately, Reynold. Thank you so much for the super chat though. Wish I could speak more about that. Reynold, do you have another question? I feel like my answer to that was kind of garbage. Let's see. Okay, we got a question here. It's interesting. Zachariah Sid says, are there any opportunities for Turkey to further expand with this whole Palestinian-Israeli war? Do they care? And then that's another interesting question. It's a much less front and center question than the Iran question. Turkey definitely has a history of supporting Hamas, but their emphasis in recent years has been more on, Israel crushes a minority, we crush a minority. Israel and Turkey just worked really closely in helping the Azeris take back their territory from Armenia. An underemphasized thing. You'd think that Israel and Armenia would have some kind of affinity as survivors of 20th century genocides, but no, actually. There's a lot of Azeri population in Iran, and Israel likes the idea of perhaps being able to leverage Azerbaijan to bring instability to Iran. So they actually, I think people talked a lot about the Turkish drones that were used by the Azeris to crush Nagorno-Karabakh, and the Armenian government that tried to defend Nagorno-Karabakh back in 2020 failed and just sort of stepped aside in recent months. What was I going to say? Any opportunities for Turkey to further expand with this whole Palestinian-Israeli war? So Turkey and Israeli relations are in a pretty good place. At a certain point, at a further point, then Iran and Hezbollah might be triggered. Turkey might be triggered as well. At a certain point, the Turkish and certainly more heavily Muslim elements in Turkish populace, still has free speech, and it's entirely possible. There are a lot of folks who've been used to, for a very long time, making a big deal about Palestine. I mean, Erdogan is being as close to Israel as the Islamist Erdogan is today is actually something that's more traditionally associated with Erdogan's enemies, the old secular elites in Turkey. So yeah, there's a point where there could be like pushback against that. Turkey is tremendously powerful in Syria. I talked about how Assad is the last thing standing between Turkey and Israel. I made that video years ago. Is there a serious scope with this particular war for Turkey to play a role? I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know. Would Erdogan try to mediate between Israel and Hamas? I feel like he'd be uniquely suited to do so, but wouldn't necessarily like the optics of that. Certainly, this war is a distraction that gives him a freer hand. The officials in the United States or Europe that would be concerned with complaining about Turkey's ongoing bombing of the Kurds in Syria and Iraq are going to be busy with other things for the next days and weeks. So that gives him a freer hand. If he wanted to, I mean, since May of 2021, or was it 2022, he's been threatening a broader incursion in Syria. If he wanted to do that now, there'd be a lot less bandwidth to condemn him or think of reasons to screw with him. So yeah, that's a possibility, but I don't know. It doesn't seem super likely to me, but I don't know. Mansour Sadok says, if Mossad would do an assassination of a Hamas leading figure as a retaliation, what will Hezbollah and Iran do? Will they be dragged into a bigger war? I think assassination, it's not, I mean, I guess it's assassination, but it's I don't know that the Israeli military, when it goes into Gaza, is going to be particularly interested in in taking any of these guys alive. Is that assassination? I mean, I think that Israel is at war. Israel is at war against Hamas. They are not trying to assassinate. They're trying to locate them so that they can be exploded. I guess that's assassination. I don't. I'm not. I don't see the real distinction between what you're talking about and like just war and what's definitely happening right now. And it seems that like Israel has the Israeli incursion into Gaza. There's wide scale bombing, horrific, families being wiped out, what have you. But like the actual boots on the ground incursion has yet to begin. But Israel's already been pretty clear about what it's going to do, and that has not sparked. That has in fact sparked Iranian distance. Erdogan just said he would not tolerate any desecration of holy sites within Palestine. That's not really, yeah, that's not, that seems like pretty light, right, Deep Diver? That just sort of seems like, I mean, so what, like, I'm pretty sure that they're not going to, like, take out the Dome of the Rock or something. So, yeah. More Freedom Foundation, where do you think the next big fight will break out globally, not just in the Middle East, or maybe if that's where you think? I've been talking for years. I think Iran is just this incredibly slept-on danger. Like, we just don't pay enough attention to it. Like a U.S.-Iran conflict, I've been really, really, really worried about it. And since Saturday, I've been even more worried about it. Abdel Kader Chelfi asks, why does the USA stand with Israel? There's so many reasons. Frankly, it is the United States. I think people really underestimate just how important the affinity between Israel and the United States are. There's a couple different levels to this. There is, Jewish people and Israeli people are different. That is not this. I mean, it's not the same thing. You can be an incredibly dedicated, incredibly dedicated. People are very dedicated to their Jewish culture or whatnot who find what Israel does abhorrent. These are two different things. However, the United States is an immigrant culture, and in different eras of the United States, different immigrant groups have been most influential. And the sort of 19th century is probably more Irish. You can argue that in the 21st century, it may in fact be Indian American, as we see most of our large tech companies beginning to be run by Indian American folks. But for the part of the late 20th century that mattered to me, and for some earlier decades, that influence, that tremendous new infusion of energy and power into the United States culture was largely Jewish. Every superhero created by men like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the high-end novels, folks in Hollywood, it's American culture is Jewish culture to an extent. And growing up, as I grew up in the tri-state area, in New York City and its environs, it was just, Zionism just was part of the package. And it really didn't, it actually took sitting with a bunch of North American Jews, Canadian and a couple guys from the US, sitting in a hookah cafe in Istanbul, and just having this really long conversation about how each of them were raised with this love of Israel and then went to Israel and were incredibly disillusioned and hurt by it. Most of them, I think many of them actually moved to Palestine, not Gaza. Though I do have a Jewish friend who lived in Gaza for a while. That would not be possible today, I do not believe. But these friends who had moved to the West Bank because they were so hurt by what the Israel they had been sold not being that. So it really took until that point, in my mid-30s, for me to fall away from the really reflexive Zionism that I've just always had. And yes, there's manipulation there. There's a lobby about it, and certainly there's all kinds of media stuff that is consciously very friendly to that probably gets more money than is entirely just. But I think that the idea that if you just threw out the Israel lobby, the scales would fall from American eyes and we'd be all about Palestine instead of Israel is not true. I think that there's really, really deep affinities. If you want to get a leftist about it, the U.S. is a settler colonial country, and so is Israel. There's deep, deep affinities between Israel and the United States that I think get people minimize it to like, oh, there's just sinister, lobby manipulation, and that's just not true. It's much deeper than that. Reynold Cherry, thank you for another super chat. I hope I'll be able to answer the question better this time. Let's see here. What do you think of the Huawei phone rumor being used by Hamas? That's why Mossad was blindsided. Wow. I haven't heard any about this. Or do you think Mossad allowed this incursion to happen to put down the hammer? No, I really, really don't think Mossad allowed this incursion to happen. I really, really don't think. I think that Israel, I have not dived in on it to the extent that I should. Again, as I've mentioned a couple times during this presentation, I just hate the topic because it's so dark and so grim, and I am responsible for it as a U.S. taxpayer to a degree. So I stay away from it. But no, I think that Israel has been a mess. I think that Netanyahu, there's this idea that Israel runs the U.S. That's not true. Actually, it's the U.S. runs Israel. Netanyahu is a particularly vile, serially failed figure who continues to run Israel because Israel is a plaything of the U.S. military-industrial complex. Netanyahu is good for missile companies more than anybody else, and he has rightly judged that being good for missile companies will keep you in power in Israel, a country that's tremendously dependent on U.S. goodwill. So the Netanyahu scourge on Israel, it has now lasted for 2 decades, has been tremendously damaging to Israeli politics and Israeli unity. And yes, the success of, beyond Netanyahu's intelligence failures and administration and security failures, just the chaos over Netanyahu. I believe there's been multiple court cases against him. There was endless elections where he was, he would manage to hold on to power through weirder and stranger coalitions. He was briefly out of power, but the coalition that got together to kick him out of power was so naturally inimical, naturally enemies of each other, that didn't work either. And Netanyahu managed to get back into power, and he's trying to change the Israeli constitution so he can continue to do crimes. He's just a nightmare situation. And I think that it's tempting to get very conspiratorial and be like, Israel wants to do genocide and they just need a good excuse, and this is how they Israel is incredibly invested in Jewish life, and they were not going to allow a situation where 1,000 Israelis were murdered. 1,000 Israeli children were murdered. I mean, men, women, children were murdered to make this happen. I do not believe that Israel is weak, that Israel looks particularly weak, but from the basic question of optics and international politics, this attack, its extraordinary success, does briefly make Israel look weak, and I don't think Mossad would ever allow that. I do think that Mossad really, really screwed this up. I have not heard about the Huawei phone rumor being used by Hamas, because Hamas only used Huawei phones, so it was harder for. That's actually interesting. So it was harder for U.S. and Israeli surveillance to know what was happening. That's fascinating. I'd be surprised if sort of NSA and especially Israeli signals intelligence didn't have ways to access Huawei phones. I've never heard that before. But that's an very interesting idea. Reynold, you're coming up with these fascinating points that I'm sadly not conversant with, and I regret that. You can ask me another question. You don't have to, give what. I'd love another super chat. Love other super chats from anybody who's willing to give them. Let's see. I am Jello. Okay. Let's see here. That's funny. Ryan says, Benjamin Netanyahu is secretly a missile disguised in a suit and tie with a face drawn on it. I believe that. This attack was absolutely embarrassing, no question. Are there any opportunities for, I think I already answered that question, Zachariah Seed. Said, I really don't like cutting and pasting. Let's see, do we have... Will Israel and Markova tanks, APCs, and IDF Caterpillar D9 bulldozers be lulled into a trap and be met with anti-tank missiles gear and cardboard drones or air intelligence support? Hezbollah team. I do not do military technology. I don't understand it. I also think that most of what we talk about is largely BS because almost none of it has been tested. I was having this argument on Twitter. I firmly believe that aircraft carriers that have not been seriously attacked since for 80 years, since World War II, are pretty useless. Because I know that during World War II, it was hard to get a missile that could hit a city. Hitler's V-2 rockets, famously couldn't, could only hit London half the time. And now we have missiles that can, take out license plates. I think aircraft carriers are useless. But broadly, we get into the minutia of especially in Ukraine coverage of HIMARS or this, that, or ATACMS or blah, 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 blah. I don't believe anything that is said about them. It's just a whole arena of geopolitical discussion that I think once we've gotten to war, we've failed. So I don't get into the weeds on that, I'm afraid. Christopher Murtaugh, I'm glad to see. I'll leave that to much more competent folks. Who's that guy? One of my favorite guys. I made a critical video about him, and he's a Chris Cappy at Task and Purpose. I made a critical video, and he actually responded, and it's been very pleasant in engagement since, which I really appreciate. And he talks about the technology of war all the time. If you want to check that out, go check out Task and Purpose. I'd be glad to see Hamas gone, but who is surprised to see this as a counter-reaction to Israeli apartheid? Do you expect a new wave of anti-Muslim rhetoric in the West like we had post 9/11? I think that, frankly, people are pretty over. I think there's a little bit of immunity in the U.S. body politic to that level of hatred and anger that we saw in the aftermath of 9/11. I do think southern Israel is not Lower Manhattan. It's not the Pentagon. I think that I think people kind of realize, and I think people are vocalizing, and on Twitter and everything, it's this is Israel's 9/11 or whatever, but doesn't that mean we should be trying to not react as stupidly as the U.S. did to the U.S. 9/11? I think there's a lot more skepticism now. I think that certainly in these first 3 days, we are getting a lot of 9/11 flashbacks. We are getting a lot of, oh God, it really just does seem just as bad, and people are getting dogpiled for being hey, wait a second, this wouldn't have happened without that little 80-year occupation, and people are getting dogpiled for that. But I think that's probably pretty brief. I think that, and horrifically, I think what Israel is about to do to Gaza will chip away at a lot of that sort of unthinking. Already. I think Netanyahu is tweeting out photos and videos of the IDF pancaking residential buildings. I haven't verified that, but they were talking about that on the Discord this morning. I just don't. I feel like the Israeli response, combined with memories of post 9/11 and how badly that went, should hopefully, maybe I'm living in a dream world, should hopefully keep there from being a broad resurgence of Islamophobia. I certainly know that I talk often about how the great anti-Islam entrepreneurs of the aughts and the teens have, since the shift in 2018, the great power competition to no, Muslims are the put upon victims in Chechnya and Xinjiang. They're not the bad guys anymore. The U.S. military is finally able to talk about the great power competition it's wanted to be doing since the end of the Cold War. So these anti-Islam entrepreneurs have been sort of out in the cold and aren't getting invited onto Fox News as much as they used to. And they're certainly having a great weekend. Had a great weekend and having a great week. But I don't expect it to last that long. Thank you, Christopher Murta. Oh, well, that was great. People are being very generous with the super chats. I appreciate that. It keeps me going, keeps me alive. So yeah, and to your broader question, Christopher, yes, like obviously, like this would not be possible without the occupation. I have sort of my standard line, which is honestly does feel a little exploded by how extreme this Hamas attack was. It's for 4 or 5 days out of every decade, Hamas is the most evil actor in the Israel-Palestine conflict. For the other 9 years and 345 days, 360 days, it's the Israeli government that is the most evil actor, and I think that is a simple truth. I mean, it is. I don't think people who call what's happening genocide are fair or accurate, but if you call it ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, if you call it apartheid more generally, you're just describing what Israel is. That's just what it is. That's just what it is and what it does, especially under Netanyahu, but really in every government since 1967. Well, since 1940, since the beginning. EU never left hatred. That's interesting. Banana Pound points out, and I think that's true. The European Union didn't leave behind hatred for Muslims the way that the United States did. This is a very grim truth. I mean, you just look at what the French government is still doing. You sort of like basically like you can't go to, it's like absurd stuff. I haven't looked into this in detail in years, but it's like absurd stuff like you can't go to a beach in a hijab or something. Like just really, really gross stuff going on in the European Union because the European Union is incredibly uncomfortable with the level of Muslim immigration that they took in. And it continues to be a real political issue, as I talked about earlier, and unfortunately will continue. Instability in North Africa, which is very Muslim, in the Middle East, is guaranteed. And I'm not as much of a climate apocalypse guy as some people are, but climate is just an added problem to the political instability that's going to make things much worse. So the pressure of it's interesting, the United States, immigration from Latin America is essentially over. We need to start more wars down there, which is perhaps what the Republican Party is trying to do by their calls for invading Mexico. But without a Republican invasion of Mexico, large-scale migration from Latin America is essentially over. Like it's been dried up. Most Mexicans are in a good enough position that they don't want to bother, and there just aren't that many Central Americans. Africa is, all of Central America, the unhappy triangle or whatever they call it, is like 40 million people. There are 1 billion people in Africa, right? Billion now, or not yet? And will be more soon. So the Europe's growing xenophobia, unfortunately, I believe, will be a story going forward for quite some time. I can't believe we still have 270 people here. I'm super tired, but I will keep going. And yeah, there are super chats incoming. So yeah. Mateo Rodriguez says, I think at this point Israel is going to create a refugee crisis to empty Gaza. How can 2 million people survive without water and food? A couple months? So the siege of Gaza is a war crime. It's a pretty obvious war crime. I think it's like an early test of, for those who aren't familiar with this, I believe it was yesterday. It was at the head of the IDF or some general was like, we are cutting off all food, water, and electricity to Gaza because these people are animals. Yeah, that's a war crime. That's an exterminatory sounding war crime. That's the kind of thing that Israel will be able to sustain for a week or two. There's no way. I mean, well, I had a friend tell me about living in Gaza and how in 2007 when he left, they said, "Oh yeah, we're just going to do this siege of Gaza for a week or two." And it's still in place 17 years later. But a full-on, because Gaza is incredibly dependent on Israel for everything. That's a dynamic that people maybe don't think about if you're trying to see this as a war between equals or something like that. So yeah, I don't think that. I mean, yeah, if that's still going on a week from now, then maybe Israel's trying it. Maybe they really are trying to uh, effect a final solution on Gaza. But I would be very surprised if they're able to maintain that full blockade of Gaza for more than a week or two. I think it's sort of in the context of making hardship higher during whatever incursion or conquest they're planning. That is a very interesting, very dark question, Mateo Rodriguez, and I'm not sure. Zionists lied to us American Jews. This is D-Man33. Us younger guys are fed up, maybe just me. Bibi allied with evangelicals, and he's surprised he's got lower support from U.S. Jews. Everyone's still fighting the 1970s. It is extraordinary how badly Netanyahu has managed the United States. I think because he's fundamentally a tool of the U.S. military-industrial complex and political figures that are allied to them. There are absolutely warmongers in the Democratic Party, but I think it's incredibly telling that both Saudi Arabia and Israel, the biggest U.S. client states in the Middle East, have gravitated so hard towards the Republican Party recently. I mean, MBS, I think almost explicitly at this point, is trying to reelect Donald Trump. And Netanyahu really just insanely decided to, because it's incredibly important for Netanyahu to maintain the Iranian enemy, he decided to go to war against Obama, turning me away from my reflexive Zionism at birth. Like, having that conversation was really important. As I mentioned, with those North American Jews talking about how disillusioning they found Israel. But another really, really important moment for me personally, where I went from being like, I'm really uncomfortable with what Israel's doing, to like, I'm fucking angry at Israel, was Netanyahu. And I was not an Obama supporter at this point, but the idea that like some tin pot Middle Eastern client state leader could come into the U.S. Congress and lecture a U.S. president, like I think it's probably a well-known secret that despite all my anti-imperial vigor, there's a pretty strong stream in me of American patriotism. It's just that I so infrequently see us doing anything worthwhile. But the idea that like some fucking country that we give $3 billion a year to, that like the leader was going to come into our Congress and lecture our president, that really, really made me angry. That was 2015. And yeah, so Netanyahu is incredible mismanagement. 15 years ago, when I was living in Washington, D.C., there was no question of any kind of breaking in the pro-Israel consensus in the United States. Netanyahu broke it. He just broke it. And that's fascinating. Yeah. So, and it is interesting. Even over, I mentioned that Israel Palestine is something, and I did grow up in the environment of New York City, and I live in New York City, and New York City is famously very Jewish American. So this conflict spills into my normie Instagram feeds. And it was interesting, like, there were a lot of people who rarely speak out about this sort of thing, who had sort of passive-aggressive you should care about what happened to these Israelis things, which, I mean, I agree, it makes sense. But there were actually some Jewish American friends of mine who were like, still like, posting the "if not now" memes, like being like, hey, like, this is Israel's fault. It's fascinating that, yeah, Israel's losing a ton of support among American Jews, which is a Really interesting dynamic that needs to be focused on more, I think. I'm getting behind on super chats. D-Man says, you rock because you draw distinctions. Most don't. I'm not sure what that was in reference to, but thank you, D-Man, for your generous super chatting. Jan, sorry, just saw your live. Do you think that Gaza will be annexed? I really appreciate your work. Please keep it up. This is a really key distinction between Gaza and the West Bank. Let me just draw up that map again. Gaza cannot be annexed. Gaza can be ethnically cleansed. But like the West Bank can be annexed, and that's just an artifact of the density of the so the Gaza Strip, 2.5 million people in that tiny little territory there by the sea and the Egyptian border, that tiny little dotted line there. The West Bank has, I think, is it 3 to 5 million people? I embarrassed. I should have looked that up before this. Has more people, but in a vastly larger territory that has already been sort of Swiss cheesed. When we're talking about Israeli annexation of Palestinian territory, it's most often happening in the West Bank. As I mentioned, Ariel Sharon actually ripped the few settlers out of the Gaza Strip because it was just too impossible to protect them. So the only way that the Gaza Strip could be annexed in any serious way, and why would you bother? Again, it's the West Bank that is the much larger chunk of territory. Like Gaza Strip is just fundamentally like an extension of Egypt, and it's important for Israel that it not be part of Egypt. But like it's one of the densest places on the planet, and it is exclusively Palestinian. So you just can't annex it really. So yeah, I think that's important. And thank you for the kind words. I think that the truly horrific prospect is that, you know, does the Israeli leadership listen to the most angry elements of its public at this point and just say all the Gazans have to leave? That is ethnic cleansing. That is and what would be one of the more extraordinary war crimes we've seen in the post-World War II era. But I don't think we're there yet. And I really hope we're not. Let's see. There was some super chats I missed. Oh wow, a lot of super chats I missed. Thank you so much. Thank you. You make great analysis. Thank you, AJCW. That's very kind. Do you have a question? I'll look out for one if you do. Premium ship toasts. That's a great avatar there. Why is there unwavering support for Israel's super aggressive foreign policy from both parties here in the States? Why are we sending them aid when we have a surplus while you have a deficit? The answer here, most people will tell you, it's the Israel lobby. It's Hollywood. No, the answer is military industrial complex. The answer is weapons companies. I've got a lot of content on my channel talking about how there's actually one specific, I should have put it in the description, but it is, does Israel run the United States or whatever, run U.S. foreign policy? It's actually the opposite. Like the Likud party, Netanyahu works for Raytheon. That's why that happened. Works for the U.S. government that is interested in selling weapons above all things. Especially in the Reagan era, the only business that government can actually control is the defense industry. This means that every congressperson, this means that every retired general wants to go work for defense companies, which means that the United States is constantly on the lookout for situations that we can make worse and sell weapons on. That's why there's a war in Ukraine. That's why we did the war on terror for a decade. That's why we destroyed Africa by destroying Libya in 2011. We like war. And Israel gives us more war and more instability than anything else. That's why there is unwavering support for Israel's super aggressive foreign policy. Frankly, the aggressive foreign policy that the U.S. and Israel have pursued in the Middle East is not to Israel's benefit. The very serious challenge, the most serious challenge to Israel that has developed over the past half century, really, over the past 40 years anyway, was in Lebanon, Hezbollah, which was a result of an Israeli invasion, a result of the chaos imposed on Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War from 1975 to 1990, I think. Hezbollah was born out of that. So how in God's name is what the United States has done to Iraq and Syria over the past 20 years in Israel's interest. That kind of chaos, that kind of horror creates the kinds of violent militias that are the greatest threat to Israel. So it's not really Israel's super aggressive foreign policy. It is the super aggressive foreign policy of Netanyahu, who is the bitch of U.S. defense companies. So yeah, I think traditionally we're like, oh, we're so deferential to IPAC and Hollywood, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, no, man, like it's actually Netanyahu that's getting ripped around and screwed over. Sorry, it's actually Israel that's getting ripped around and screwed over by a bunch of U.S. weapons companies that don't care that we're creating the Hezbollahs of the 2040s in Iraq and Syria and Egypt. It's a really terrifying possibility. So yeah. Iranian public doesn't want to fight for Palestine. Is that true? I think it's an interesting question. Would the Iranian public want to fight for Palestine if Tehran was bombed by Israel and the United States? Because who knows? Who knows what joy can be produced by as violent as we like to be. Will the UK rejoin the EU? I think so, if there's an EU. This is Jan asks, will the UK rejoin the EU? I think that the UK will rejoin the EU, the European Union, if the European Union still exists. I think that some kind of European unity is such a natural, positive thing that it will exist. But like to what extent, of what nature, that will still be the European Union. I think the European Union has survived a lot. It probably will still exist. And I think the United Kingdom, after, I don't know if it'll be another 5 years or another 15 years, or 50 years of stumbling around on its own, will, I think, probably eventually decide that the EU is the right thing to do. Of course, the European Union has to actually figure out how to grow its economy again in a serious way before that becomes a particularly attractive prospect. But the UK is actually in worse economic shape than the EU, and as it has been since it left. The protagonist asks, to fix immigration decline and apologize for war crimes, can the U.S. trade our war criminals in exchange for more immigrants, economically efficient? That is a great idea. So what we send the Cheney family and the Bush family overseas. And in return, get a whole bunch of Latin Americans, get a whole bunch of Africans. It's an interesting idea, the protagonist. But I think at this point we're going to keep our war criminals and we're going to continue to get migrants as well, which is great. Immigration decline is a very serious issue, something I'm very worried about. I'm writing a book now called American Empire, the First 100 Years, and I talk about how one of the greatest self-inflicted wounds we ever committed was the 1920s immigration restrictions. Were the first time in our history we succeeded in seriously stopping immigration flows, which made us weaker for the whole rest, every year that came thereafter. And that Donald Trump tried to do something similar. Thankfully, Donald Trump is so bad at everything he tries that while there was a real drop in immigration during his time in power, it does seem as though the intricacies of immigration have been something I've always wanted to tackle, but I would have to just tackle that for a couple months and nothing else to truly understand it. But my understanding from other things that I've read is that many kinds of migration have largely recovered under the Biden administration, and I was very worried about that. So I think we're okay, but don't take my word for that. There's a $10 super chat that I missed somewhere. Where was it? King, let's celebrate their first super on a live stream. All right, King, thank you. There's a number one, and let's separate their first super on a live stream. I don't know what that means. It's a super chat. Well, thank you, King, for that super chat. Do you have a question, King? King, I just wanted to thank him for his coverage. Well, thank you, King. That's very kind. That's a very generous super chat. Thank you. Will the East African Federation ever be formed? Oh man, I need to learn more about the African Union. I need to learn more about ECOWAS, the East African Federation. So that's like Rwanda, Kenya. I don't know. I don't know enough about that. I've certainly seen people talk about it before, Jan, but I don't. Is it Jan or Jan? I don't think I've. I can't speak to that. Yeah, I can't speak to that. Obviously, broader forms of African unity and organizations that sponsor African unity are something that would be very good. We are closing in on the end of the presentation here. I will continue answering questions if there are super chats, more super chats. I will keep going if people pay me, and it is great to have 240 people here. But what do you think about the future of AI? I will do that after my spieling here. My name is Robert Morris. I upload videos very often on TikTok and YouTube at the More Freedom Foundation. Actually, I guess on YouTube it's the Mo Freedom Foundation because there are they don't allow that many characters. So yeah, Mo Freedom Foundation. Here on YouTube, join me here. I have a podcast that's been very successful recently. You can find that on the community tab. Links to that. People really enjoy Rory and I discussing the problems with the world. TikTok, I have written a number of books. If you're interested on my take on the Middle East region, more generally, you can read Everybody's Lying About Islam, which went pretty well. My most recent magnum opus, which is 4 years old now, was Avoiding the British Empire. It's a doorstop of a book that kind of, I think, explains everything in the world and talks about how the British Empire is a lot more similar to U.S. empire than we typically talk about, and how the United States is making a lot of similar mistakes, which is a problem. So you can check out that book, Avoiding the British Empire. If you're interested in supporting my work, Patreon is the way to go. I'd be delighted if you'd consider signing up there. If you do, you get access to 2 patron-specific pieces of content every month. I have fallen off on the big public live chats like this, regretting it because I'm getting thousands of people have watched this. I've fallen off the public live chats recently because I just don't have so much time. But I do a patrons only live chat where I interact with every single comment because there's only 5 or 10 people who watch that live. So you get access to that, the patrons only newscast every month, and also a very informal give and take Discord chat on the patrons only Discord server. So those are all cool things you should sign up to, and please to support my work and keep me going. Am I missing anything? Is there something else I should be spieling? Logo. Logo's put a link to the Patreon in the chat. I'd be honored if you check that out. Oh my gosh. Oh God. I've got a lot of super chats to do now. I'm getting tired, but I must continue because people are continuing to pay me, and I'm very grateful. Thank you. What do you think about the future of AI? I think it is incredibly important. I think it is incredibly fascinating. I think it is. There's a classic Bill Gates quote. I think it's Bill Gates, who's like, people really overestimate the impact that things are going to have in 5 years and really underestimate the impact things are going to have in 10 years. I think that's kind of probably where I'm at with AI. I don't think every job is going to be annihilated. It's certainly made my job a lot easier. I don't know if you guys have watched my produced videos recently, but in addition to the stock footage I've been using, I've now been adding more and more Mid-Journey generated AI art, and I think it's fun. I think it makes for better videos. I'm excited to do a few more of those. It's been a while since I've done a produced video. But yeah, I think it's fascinating. I've got a couple podcasts where I talk about AI, and I can't remember what I said in them. I think that I'm really concerned about where we are as we launch into an AI existence. I think that as AI is essentially the automation of thought and society, and I'm concerned that the initial condition, the point at which we're at in 2023, when some of these dynamics get set, I think that we're in this sort of like period of uncertainty that's still very like neoliberal or Reaganite or this, that, and the other thing. And if we just sort of create our robot overlords with the idea that like what we need is sort of libertarian anarcho-capitalism, I do worry that might have some dystopian effects. But anyway, I think that's 2 Swiss francs version of thoughts on AI. Can we ultimately blame the British for this? Of course. Of course. Yeah, the Israel-Palestine conflict is British. We can also blame Woodrow Wilson. I always like blaming Woodrow Wilson. If it weren't for Woodrow Wilson coming in to save the British and the French during World War One, then the Germans would have won back then. And if the Germans had won back then there never would have been a Hitler, never would have been a Holocaust, never would have been an Israel. Yeah, so yeah, it's Woodrow Wilson's fault. It's also the British fault. Specifically, the British, to be more serious, the British were in control of Palestine, the Mandate of Palestine between, was it up until 1948? But between the 1920s, taken from the Ottoman Empire during World War One up until 1948, I believe. And yes, they definitely had a lot to do with large-scale Jewish migration to Palestine. Not just that, but also incredibly mismanaging that large-scale migration. It's possible to imagine a world where Israelis and Palestinians could have gotten on. I mean, it's hard, but the British certainly acted in every way possible to make things worse. So yes, we can definitely blame the British for this. Another super chat. Where was that? Oh, no, did I miss one? Oh, God, I missed so many. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Thanks for your answer to my question. I've been a fan for years since you had a few thousand followers. I wish more people knew about your work. Thank you, Premium Ship Toast. I feel the same way. Premium Ship Toast. But is there a question? Well, thank you. That's just being kind. Hey, do you think the siege of Gaza and civilian... Mate, it's your first super chat. Thank you so much. Hey, do you think the siege of Gaza and the civilian population suffering will change Western perception of the conflict? I think that's been changing a Western perception of the conflict for the past 20 years, in addition to Netanyahu's incredible mismanagement. I think specifically also the fact that the incredible swing towards sympathy towards Israel that we're seeing in the United States, at least right now, can be diminished by the siege of Gaza and civilian population, but it's entirely dependent on what happens. I don't think that Israel is going to have any meaningful restraint on what they want to do for the next couple weeks, and how ruinous that is will determine how much longer that lasts. And if Iran jumps in, they'll be able to do what they want for, and as long as the war lasts. Will Biden win in 2024? Man, I hope so. Yeah, I'm not going to be coy about that one. Honestly, I'd be much happier if Biden stepped down. I think it's time for somebody who's not in their 80s to be president, or 70s either. But obviously, I'd vastly prefer him to Trump or pretty much any imaginable Republican. The Republican Party has committed itself to invading Mexico, so that. Anyway, there are many other reasons to not support the Republican Party, but that's a pretty big one. Like, the Republican Party's like, do you like what we did to the Middle East? Would you like us to do it to North America? Yeah, no, never. Never vote for a Republican if they're talking about invading Mexico. Will Biden win in 2024? I think that if Biden can stay alive, stay coherent, make it through a debate, still saying full sentences, he will be able to beat Donald Trump. Could he beat Nikki Haley? Probably not. As nasty, Nikki Haley has worse international politics than Donald Trump does, meaning she's just got George W. Bush's international politics, which are horrific and killed utopia. Just funny because it was George W. Bush's father who kind of built what could have been a post-Cold War utopia, and then his son killed it. Will Biden win in 2024? So yeah, I think he could definitely beat Trump, but there's so many variables here. The economy could crash, hyperinflation could come back. I just don't know. So I would definitely lean towards Biden beating Trump in a matchup in 2024, but God, how horrific would it be to have that matchup? And is this my last super chat? That was my last super chat. Can I go now? Let's see. So, is there any more spieling that I had to do? Is there any last super chat? Any final words? Um, huh. Everybody should join Patreon. That would be great. The Discord's great. Discord's a lot of fun. The Discord channel is available to patrons only, and I think that because it's available to patrons only, it's just like a really high quality of conversation. It's just a lot of folks who, in some cases, know more about what's going on all over the world than I do, and a lot of really sort of committed, interested folks chatting about stuff. So I'd highly recommend signing up for Patreon to get access to the Discord channel and other benefits that you can find. Anyway, thanks so much. Y'all are the best. And I think, oh, there's David Masaka. Thanks for your work. It really gives context. Well, thank you for that last super chat. This has been an amazing presentation. I mean, here I am profiting from doom. But it's been nice to do a live for the first time in a while and to see so many people watching. It's always good to be heard, and I think that I'm not. I think I'm adding some valuable context to what's going on here. Wow, Evan Friedman asked me something and then it disappeared. It's good to see you at 40Ks. Oh yeah, 40K subscribers. That's nice. Rob, I'm also an old fan, and please can you touch upon how would all this affect Turkey? I did talk about that earlier in the presentation. Turkey, I think Turkey's probably got a freer hand to F. Yolo Swaggins. That's a great avatar. I think Turkey has a freer hand in Iraq and Syria now than it would have last week. Not that it wasn't already bombing Iraq and Syria, but it can do so more if it wants to. I think there's scope for Erdogan could, find ways to be seen as, he probably wouldn't straight up mediate, but he can find ways to look like the good guy here that would be appreciated in the United States and Europe, which might be another opportunity for Turkey. Do you like Macron? Asks Jan with another super chat. Do I like Macron? I have not made a big study of Macron. I think you've got to be impressed with Macron. I mean, he's been in charge of France for like a decade, and didn't he do so outside of, it hasn't been a decade, but it's been a while. It's been at least 5 years, right? And a couple elections, and he's done so outside of the, I think he did so without the traditional parties, right? I do like that Macron seems to be kind of honest about how poorly the EU, how poorly NATO serves Europe in a lot of ways. He's obviously had to have been a bit quieter about that in a recent year or so. I don't know if I like Macron. For a long time, I was a pretty hyper neoliberal, pro-business, capitalist guy. That's been falling away. I still am. Will be. If the United States goes too far in a Bernie Biden direction. But I think I've fallen away from that youthful approach to things, and I think when I was younger, I'm more libertarian. I might have liked Macron better, but even now, I do believe that certain countries have had enough of neoliberalism, have had enough of Anglo-Saxon economics, like the United States and the UK. But I do think there are elements of the French economy that might benefit from a little bit more sort of neoliberalism, and that's what Macron, I think, is trying to bring. But I have not done any kind of in-depth analysis of Macron or his economic legacy in France, so take it with that grain of salt. Hey Mo, do you have any pets? I do not have any pets. It's funny, I have been traveling a lot recently, but I even much more than I would like. But that's over. I do tend to like to be traveling every 3 months or so. I like to leave for 2 weeks and just having a pet. I've got plants, but having pets would be a little too much, I think. Okay. Rob, why has your face not changed in the last 7 years? Have you discovered an immortality potion? Love your work. Don't drink. I smoke a lot. I smoke a lot of cigars. I don't think that's probably not recommended. Why has my face not changed in the last 7 years? I mean, if you look, there's videos. I think I've got videos from 2011, 2012, and I look a lot younger. But yeah, I would recommend. I would recommend not drinking. I would recommend not having an alarm clock. I would recommend doing work that you love, and having very little stress in your life. Perhaps to a fault. Perhaps to a fault. That's very kind of you to say, Ramton. All right, it's been 2 hours and 12 minutes. I've not seen any more super chats. I'm going to bail. Thank you. Oh, God. You keep me going, Jan. What is the future of religion? That's a really small topic, Jan. I mean, thank you. I'm very grateful for the super chat. That's very kind. What is the future of religion? I think that there will always be a spiritual element in a human life. There's always a need for something. I think we're in a period of flux, a period of religions, more established religions, at least in the United States, really falling out of favor. So it's interesting. I was talking recently. When I was a kid, I would, or in my 20s, if a woman started talking about astrology, I'd be like, not dating this girl anymore. But now it's so omnipresent that if I want to date women, I have to be like, oh yeah, I'm a Cancer, or your house is rising or whatnot. Like, the fall of mainstream Christianity in the United States has been extreme. I went to college in the Midwest, and most of my friends were raised in some kind of Christian faith tradition, and none of them are raising their children in one. Perhaps that's because maybe my friends skewed a little Catholic, and there's obviously been some recent trouble with them. The U.S. Religion is declining. Traditional, so people are much more interested in believing in all kinds of woo super stuff that was traditionally seen as superstition. It's the Chesterton quote is like, when they stop believing in Christianity, they'll believe in anything. So everybody's big into astrology instead of going to church or whatever. There was another example I was thinking of recently. I think there's always scope for superstition or spirituality or what have you, and just what that might be is changing. And who knows, maybe there'll be a completely different sort of... Oh yeah, there was a great article talking about how therapy is the new religion. How I'm certainly an adherent. I've gotten some improvements in my life over the past couple of years, and some painful experiences because of going to therapy. But that's kind of a religion here in New York as well. And in growing swaths of the country. I think there's always a space for religion, but what that might be will mean different things. Okay, it's 2:15. I've been doing this for 2 hours and 15 minutes. Even though there's almost 200 people here still, it's amazing. I have to go. There's tons more content on my channel. Check out those videos. Thanks.